Whenever I release a new video, I am typically not repeating everything that I teach or that Saif and I teach in detail, and rather focus on some specific aspect of the Dhamma or on virtue. And in doing so, I presuppose some knowledge in you, the viewer. While I use the same words that you know, you would be surprised by how often I mean something entirely different. In fact, if you are new, I would not be surprised if every single Pali word that I use means something different to me compared to you. I am aware that this is a very dry-seeming topic and people usually ignore it, but it is of utmost importance, so maybe give this video an honest try. Just to start with some of the more popular examples, the words sila, sati, samadhi, paticca and even panya usually mean something completely different in each modern tradition or school of Buddhism. Sila is usually equated with the 5 precepts. Sati is, usually watching some airflow in some part of your body. Samadhi is usually some kind of calm. Jhana is usually associated with the pleasure of intense focusing meditations. Independent origination sometimes, or even oftentimes, has some 3 life interpretation and is not visible here and now, as the Buddha explained. So whenever I use those words, I assign them a very distinct meaning in my head and in the way I teach, and I explain that usually, for example, in my book, that I have clarified for myself over the years, and that makes sense in experiential reality and not just in some logical thinking that I apply to the suttas so that they fit my way of teaching. I really try to focus on the suttas, on my experience, and then teach based on that. Anyway, now depending on your background and prior knowledge, you very likely have a partially or completely different interpretation of all those words that will very likely be flawed in some way or another, otherwise you would be a sotapanna and basically free from suffering. So that should be the standard. That should be the metric you use to judge if your understanding is already perfect. And some of the statements I make will not even make sense to you at all, simply because my words point to completely different mental models, so to speak. And given those mental models, they might make sense to me, but very likely won't make sense to you, and you have to clarify your understanding further. And just so I also include the most important words in the list, even though many schools do not emphasize them anymore, by default, your understanding of the word dukkha and tanha, or suffering and craving, is always wrong, at least partially. This is a very core of wrong understanding or wrong view that shackles us to samsara and suffering. We suffer because we do not know what suffering really is. If we knew what suffering is and how it came to be, we would immediately stop suffering in 99% of the cases. It is just that we don't know what suffering is. We may be suffering. We very well are. Most people are. But we do not know why we suffer or what we are even suffering. This is just to illustrate that it is good to not assume your understanding to be perfect until you are actually free from suffering. Then you can very much have confidence in your understanding. So what is the problem here? Well, think about it for a moment. It is, again, the problem of differing views, ideas, mental models. There is, as an example, what the Buddha knew, and there are the words that he used to describe that very thing. The words are not the knowledge, but they are necessary to transfer that knowledge from one mind to another. Words are pointing the way, but the Buddha cannot go the way for you, and he did say so very explicitly in the suttas, for example, in Dhammapada, verse 276, I believe. And there are other suttas where he explains the very same thing. It goes as follows: Kevata, there are these 3 miracles that I have declared, having directly known and realized them for myself. Which 3? The miracle of psychic power, the miracle of telepathy, and the miracle of instruction. And what is a miracle of instruction? There is a case where a monk gives instruction in this way. Direct your thought in this way. Don't direct it in that way. Attend to things this way. Don't attend to them in that way. Let go of this. Enter and remain in that. And the Buddha even declared the miracle of instruction to be the greatest miracle of them all. It is completely incomparable to the others. Most normal people would think that telepathy and, all the superpowers that a practitioner may develop are superior superpowers, and the people in the sutta also thought that in the beginning. But in the end, the Buddha convinced them that the miracle of instruction is the greatest miracle of them all, simply because you can find the way out of suffering forever based on those instructions. And it is by no means easy. In fact, teaching others is surprisingly difficult. So the Buddha did call it a miracle that it is even possible to guide others out of their own suffering, simply because they are completely enclosed in their suffering. But anyway, as you can see, teaching is not simple. In fact, the Buddha declared that it is not easy to be a speaker on the Dhamma. And that is something that only very few people, and even arahants, are good at. As an example, in the suttas, the Buddha did distinguish between people who are foremost when it comes to expounding the Dhamma in detail. And he listed that for householders and monks and other people, and for various different qualities. So there are differences. Only when it comes to the personal liberation are arahants identical. Put it like that. But anyway, the Buddha found it very difficult to teach and repeatedly said so. He explained that it is not easy at all to be a good speaker on the Dhamma, and even among very advanced monks, there were differences. You can be an arahant and quite bad at teaching, as an example. And as an example, one very important precondition does exist, though, namely that when you have not understood the Dhamma, then you can, per definition, only be a bad speaker on the Dhamma. As an example, in Majjhima Nikaya number 8, you have to at least have understood the Dhamma if you want to teach it. Otherwise, you would just be causing much more harm than good, and it would be, well, like the blind leading the blind. And the sutta goes as follows. Unda, that one who is himself sinking in the mud should pull out another who is sinking in the mud is impossible. That one who is himself not sinking in the mud should pull out another who is sinking in the mud, that is possible. That one who is himself untamed, undisciplined, with defilements unextinguished, should tame another, discipline himself, and help extinguish his defilements is impossible. That one who is himself tamed, disciplined, with defilements extinguished, should tame another, discipline him, and help him extinguish his defilements, that is possible. Or in short, you can only really teach others what you have known and realized for yourself. This also means that you cannot help anyone with Dhamma practice, and this might sound harsh, unless you have at least the right view. If you don't have the right view, you might be able to point them to teachers, but you cannot even judge if those teachers are any good, because you have not seen it for yourself. And this is very important to keep in mind. For example, if you want to teach others how to repair cars, then you should at least have understood how to repair cars, otherwise you cannot teach it. It really is impossible. And the same is true for mundane activities like building chariots, repairing cars, and all the other things. And the same is in the same way true for teaching the Dhamma. There's no real difference. The person without the right view is himself sinking in the mud, and as such, he can neither free himself nor others. He has a wrong view on dependent origination and the Four Noble Truths. His understanding is flawed, and in some way or another, and that would very much reflect in the words he used. As an example, the Buddha can phrase the Dhamma in different ways for 100 years and could still continue, while a Padujana could only really repeat what he had, well, memorized. And sadly, I have forgotten the sutta number where that came from, but very likely someone in the comments will know that. But anyway, just to make it even more clear what I mean, and this is now a very important slide. What you see here is two mental models, and I like to display them as mind maps. There's obviously some information missing, but the general idea should be clear. A very mundane person is saying something at the top, and the Buddha is saying something at the bottom. The Buddha has a bottom mental model, as an example, or any enlightened being has a bottom mental model, and any unenlightened being might have some model that is a bit like the one at the top. And in this case, we use the word feeling. Feeling is at the middle of the diagram, and that person at the top thinks of feeling as sensation watching. He thinks of feeling as some warmth or sensation of warmth in the body. He thinks of a tingling sensation. He thinks of something distant, something cold, or emotions even. He thinks of being bored, excited, sad, happy, or all kinds of other things. That is what he relates to as feeling, even though in reality that might be much more closer related to sanya or perceptions, sensations in the body. Yet that is a typical mental model when it comes to feeling. When the Buddha, however, talks about the word feeling, he usually talks about Vedana, which can only be good, bad, or neither good nor bad, which we sometimes label as neutral. And he also thinks about it in terms of dependent origination, namely it being the direct condition for tanha, and vice versa too, and all those other things. So the Buddha's mental model, when it comes to the word feeling, is very different from your mental model. And your job as a practitioner is to refine your understanding in that way, but not only the intellectual understanding, but also very much the experiential understanding. And I really like to illustrate that in diagrams like this. You have a certain idea of the word feeling in this example. And by the way, you have to understand all the words, not just one word, at least the The very core of the Dhamma has to be understood. You don't have to know all the words, but you certainly have to have the right mapping. At least have to understand the very fundamental core principle of dependent origination. And I just chose feeling as an example, because based on feeling, you can understand your entire experience. So in this case, your idea of the word feeling is very different from what feelings actually are. Our minds typically add a lot of self, a lot of other things to the word feeling, and thus we misconceive it. We misunderstand what feelings are. We do not see them as an aggregate standing on their own. We also add self to it, add a center to it, and all the other things. So if we truly want to understand what feeling is, we must transcend feeling. We must step outside of feeling. We must become akin to an observer to feelings. Otherwise, our understanding will be flawed in one way or another. We would be biased simply because we understand the word through certain ideas and views that we already have. And those are sadly, per default, tainted by craving. And as such, our understanding will always be flawed, and we cannot reason our way out of it. That is not possible. But through an attempt of understanding, in our experience, what feelings even are, and the relationship to craving, as an example, then we can make a breakthrough to the Dhamma. But we must really, really be able to abandon our prior understanding of those words. And we must really acknowledge that our understanding is very likely not optimal. It might be developing in the right direction. There's no question about it. And it's good if it does. But until you have reached the right view, you should leave room for error. You should be clear that your understanding cannot be perfect. So whenever I say a word, be really careful and double check if you suspect I could mean something different, and investigate. Either I am wrong in stating whatever logic I'm displaying, or you are wrong in your understanding of whatever logic or reasoning I am displaying. Whenever I say something that does not make sense to you, there's either something wrong with what I say, or you have an assumption or wrong view that makes no sense given the words I use, because you map them to different things in your mind. When you are not free from suffering, I would suggest to check with the suttas and see if your understanding conflicts with them. Chances are quite good that it is your understanding and not the suttas that are wrong, or the words of some famous Dhamma teachers that are wrong. Whenever you find problems, rather throw some views of yours away, or question them at least, instead of throwing the suttas or the Dhamma away. While we usually all cling to our views and to being right, it might help to recall our own past history of being wrong. It happens all the time. Whenever we learn something new, it automatically also means that our past knowledge was at least partially wrong. This trend has, well, at least been going on since we were born, and there's no reason to assume that right now, this moment right now, is any different. By the way, this does not mean that you should throw away everything that you know. It just means that you should leave room for change and improvement if something better comes along. Then you should, by all means, accept that something better. We also should, by all means, throw away an inferior pleasure and replace it by something better. The pleasure of renunciation as an example. And this brings us to the very core of the Dhamma, and the most important thing, namely stream entry, really is about understanding in what way you yourself are creating your own suffering so that you can stop it. It is no magical blinking out of consciousness moment or anything. It is simply the understanding of how you may no longer suffer, what you must do and not do so that suffering is extinguished. You simply understand the training and process that lead to the complete cessation and eradication of suffering with 100% confidence. If you receive no additional instructions whatsoever, you know what you must do from then on. That said, make sure that it is not only understanding intellectually, but also a realization in your direct experience. It must really be an earth-shattering experience, otherwise you have not seen the Dhamma. And once you see the Dhamma, your suffering is simply gone for the most part. The mental part, so to speak, of pain is no longer there. The mental part, one could argue, is the biggest part of pain. And how does it all work? Well, as always, it is the entirety of the Noble Eightfold Path paired with the prior training in virtue and contemplation. Only based on virtue can suffering be gone for long enough for you to realize that it is gone and what you have done to make it leave. You've no longer fueled your suffering. Without virtue, it is 100% impossible to attain the Dhamma. And I'm not meaning the watered-down 5 precepts kind of virtue, but the virtue taught in the suttas. The virtue that is directly connected with the rest of the path and not something extra. It is not really some religious kind of virtue or some preaching kind of moral or anything. It is subjective virtue. It is a presence of craving in your experience that determines good, bad, or neutral. Tame the mind, and you will see for yourself. You must see for yourself. You can only really judge the progress you make by the degree of your own liberation. But anyway, let us now come to the most important part. First, Words are a bit like fingers pointing to the moon, as a famous nun, Theravadan Buddhist nun, Ayakema once said. They can mean very different things for each of us, and they very likely do. Be very careful on blindly assuming that we mean the same thing. Fully understanding what craving or suffering is means that you are free from it. Fully understanding feeling means that you are an arahant, basically. If you no longer misconceive feeling, then you cannot suffer any longer, because we are always suffering a feeling. And when we understand feeling completely, then there's no longer any tendency that may arise on account of it that makes us suffer. If you are not free from suffering, it is safer to accept that you are at least partially wrong with your understanding of the practice, and usually also the words that are involved, because the pointers that other people use to teach can sometimes be meaning something very different in your mind. And in that case, you must be very careful and always reassess, is what I'm doing leading, maybe after initial worsening, to more freedom, more peace, and more of the good qualities, or is it leading down a bad? But anyway, this should be enough for today. Thank you very much for watching. If you like what I do, feel free to like and subscribe and do the YouTube things. But until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.